I was recently in North Fort Myers and I couldn't believe how much this area has changed. Now, North Fort Myers used to be a zombieland apocalypse of homelessness and crime. On our recent trip, we discovered that North Fort Myers has changed a lot. Crossing the bridge from Fort Myers into North Fort Myers was like going on a wildlife safari of inbred trailer park Hickory. Thankfully, Hurricane Ian flooded North Fort Myers and destroyed many of the river adjacent communities. Unfortunately, many of the worst neighborhoods survived and they are still standing today. Recently, there's been a lot of development in North Fort Myers, and I couldn't believe how many new apartment complexes have gone into this area. But despite all of the growth in North Fort Myers, all you have to do is walk a few hundred feet away from all these new apartments to find yourself in the midst of a homeless camp shantytown. So as you're driving on the main streets, it may appear like North Fort Myers is changing, but deep down, many of the problems that have plagued this community for decades are still here in the underbelly. Now, it's been less than a year since the last time I went to North Fort Myers, and I can't believe how much it's changed. We're talking new luxury apartments and developments and shopping plazas that were completely abandoned and were being used for nothing more than vast homeless camps. Like right behind the Applebee's, you can see that this entire plaza is now well lit and the businesses are well lit as well. This looks like a normal functioning shopping plaza. This is an incredible improvement if you remember what was here before. This entire shopping plaza was nothing more than a giant open-air homeless camp, if not a market for illicit activities. Today, this shopping plaza is well lit, well painted, well manicured, and it has luxury apartments right across the street. If you had seen this shopping plaza perhaps a year and a half ago, you would never think how much this area has improved in a very short amount of time. To be honest, North Fort Myers really has improved tremendously. You wouldn't be walking in this shopping plaza with your family and kids a year and a half ago. It was just a very scary place. However, despite the aesthetical improvements at first glance, if you just hang around long enough, you'll discover that some of the aspects that made North Fort Myers unattractive are still present here. Now, don't get me wrong, there's been great improvements. I mean, for one thing, there's a freaking Starbucks in this shopping plaza now. But my hood sense was ting-a-ling-a-ling, and I went around the back where I found homeless people with bicycle trailers dumpster diving, which goes to show that many of the improvements that we see in North Fort Myers are simply superficial. Now, usually when you hear a story from homeless people, you really gotta take it with a grain of salt because homeless people usually say some really crazy things. But when you hear a story once, twice, 3 and 4 times, it makes you wonder if there's any credibility to it. But I'm just gonna go ahead and tell you that the urban legend is that over the years, the site where these new apartments are going in used to be homeless camps, were used as clandestine cemeteries by the homeless who died from overdoses, injuries, and others under mysterious injury circumstances, and the homeless would just clandestinely bury their own in the homeless camps because they didn't want to get law enforcement involved in the case of, for example, somebody overdosing. Now, these are stories that have run rampant through the homeless community here in North Fort Myers, so it's kind of like an urban legend that underneath all these new apartments are cemeteries for homeless people that died under some very mysterious circumstances. But now that these apartments are all brand new and families have moved in, it's very unlikely that any discovery of this sort will be made. But of course, those are just urban legends that the homeless people tell, and of course, what credibility could homeless people have, right? After all, we would have to have more faith in law enforcement and the wholesome team of Lee County officials and know that they did their due diligence before these places were developed. I mean, really, would you believe a homeless person or a Lee County official? Who has more credibility? You know what? I would pretend like we didn't even hear all that. Like, that was just a bunch of nonsense. We're going to pretend like we didn't even hear that. I mean, hey, I'm a news reporter, so if I'm just doing news stories in your community and I discover the story that's going around that underneath all these apartment complexes is a clandestine cemetery of the homeless people, I'm sure the people that are going to rent those apartments from New York will have no idea anyway. So why even mention something like that if it's not even true? I wouldn't even say nothing like that. So the issue really stems from the fact that law enforcement in Lee County just doesn't have good relationships with the public. So take the case of homeless people. When somebody dies in a homeless camp, they can call law enforcement and say, hey, Larry overdosed, or they can be like, hey, let's put Larry in that hole down there. And they're going to develop this law anyways, and we'll never hear about him ever again. And many times the homeless people bury their own homeless clandestinely. Many times they're not even aware that they're doing something inappropriate. They just believe that this is how homeless people handle these situations. And after all, if there's a homeless camp with 5, 10, 15 homeless people and one of them perishes, if they bring in law enforcement to report somebody dying, the cops are just going to make them close down the homeless camp. So the logical thing to do is when somebody dies in a homeless camp in Florida is to bury them clandestinely. Now, I've actually done stories about this before for my YouTube channel. So if you've been watching my YouTube channel, this isn't your first time hearing about this. But anyways, the urban legend says that underneath some of these apartment complexes in North Fort Myers are some interesting archaeological ruins of Larry, Billy, Paul, and a crackhead from New York that came down here a few years ago, and then she didn't even have family. So it's not even a missing person case. So it's not even a missing person case. So it's not even a big deal. It's probably some Indians or something down there. This really shouldn't come as a surprise in Lee County anyways. Over the years, we've seen many stories out of Lee County, Florida, where they would find empty lots that have like numbers of skeleton remains, and they never really discover who they were. So this isn't exactly a new phenomenon in Lee County, so it wouldn't be out of the realm of reality. In fact, some of the OGs may remember that a while back there was a story out of Fort Myers where an undercover police officer discovered a body because he could smell it, and the body was in an open field in the middle of the city of Fort Myers, and nobody called the cops to report it. It was law enforcement that discovered the body because of the smell, because in the community, nobody really called the cops. This is a real story out of Fort Myers. If you're an OG, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So it isn't a surprise that till this day, people like these people here who are living clandestinely on the streets of Fort Myers, if somebody dies in the woods, they would just kind of handle that, in a very clandestine fashion versus calling, like the big Cadillac SUV that somebody's got to pay for. Now, I usually have the habit of clipping the news stories when I tell you guys about a video, but recently I've discovered that the internet kind of like automatically deletes itself every few years. Newspapers and other people who publish stories, after a while, they are no longer accessible to the internet. It's something about the internet these days where they don't want stories from 2 or 3 years ago to keep coming back up, so it disappears on the internet. But if you're an OG over here, you remember these stories. Now, a while back, I made some videos about North Fort Myers, and in these videos, I mentioned that North Fort Myers was the worst part of the entire metropolitan area that ruffled a lot of feathers because North Fort Myers is a white area, and people in Fort Myers just naturally assume that the worst areas have to be Hispanic or black. But in reality, to be fair, North Fort Myers continues to be the worst part of Lee County, Florida. It's got the highest overdoses. It's got the poorest communities, the lowest real estate values. For all practical purposes, North Fort Myers, even with all these good changes, continues to be probably the worst part of the city of Fort Myers. And I know that hurt a lot of feelings because for some reason that title of being the worst neighborhood in Fort Myers just didn't really sit well with a lot of people. So if you hear people talking about how North Fort Myers is changing and new apartments and buildings are going in everywhere, just remember that all you have to do is walk behind the tree line, and just about everywhere you look in North Fort Myers are entire camp cities of the homeless. This area is still plagued with homelessness and addiction on a massive scale. Now, Lee County Sheriff's Office is pretty freaking brutal, and the homeless people have to hide pretty well. But once you go behind the tree line, it's like a whole nother world that you may drive past every single day but not really know is back there. And this is really the crazy thing about Florida, is how well hidden these places are. But don't forget these places exist and these people are in your community. This part of North Fort Myers is called Pomona Park. Notice that right underneath this tree, homeless people hang out. Last time we did a video there was actually needles all over the ground. This is one of the major intersections in North Fort Myers. You've probably driven through here at some point, Pine Island Road and US 41. Now, at first glance, this neighborhood has improved tremendously. This was a complete crap hole of drug dealing, but now it's cleaned up considerably and there's a lot more street lights. It just looks cleaner and nicer. But if you take a closer look, let's spin around this block one more time slowly. You'll see right here that there's actually homeless people living just behind the tree line. So if you drive by quickly, you wouldn't even notice. So a while back, people here in Pomona Park had been reporting a drug house, and there were like hundreds of police phone calls from the neighbors complaining about a particular drug house back here in Pomona Park. Now, the interesting thing was that despite the fact that the community had complained hundreds of times, Lee County Sheriff's Office never shut down this trap house. Interestingly, the people went on the Lee County Sheriff's Facebook page and started to say, hey, while you're showing off for social media, as you guys know, the Lee County Sheriff, Marcino, likes to be in front of the cameras quite a bit and proclaim that he's doing a good job. So the people of Pomona Park got together and they started blasting all over social media how the Lee County Sheriffs had been there hundreds of times to one particular house and they still hadn't shut down this trap house. That was right when the Lee County Sheriff's Office stopped allowing people to comment on his Facebook account. They were the first law enforcement agency here in Southwest Florida to stop letting people comment on their Facebook. And unfortunately, now the Collier County Sheriff's Office is doing the same thing. But this whole thing happened revolving around the notion that people in Pomona Park started to blast on social media that they have had a trap house that they've been complaining about for a very long time, and the sheriff's office had done nothing about it. And it wasn't like 1, 2, 3 phone calls. It was getting into the hundreds of phone calls, different disputes, arguments. This was a complete problem house. It looks like recently they finally went in and took care of the problem because it looks a lot quieter in Pomona Park than it did in the past. But it doesn't change the reality that for many of these poor neighborhoods in Lee County, Florida, sure, the rich people, they get law enforcement presence and they do everything for them. But if you live in North Fort Myers, they don't care too much about your neighborhood. It really takes extra attention for law enforcement to shut down a trap house if you live in one of these poor parts of Lee County. Basically, if you live in a trailer park in North Fort Myers, your police call isn't as important as, let's say, somebody in a gated community. And you know, the same thing happened to us when we lived in Naples, Florida. We lived in a place similar to this, just mobile homes, and we would always have to call the cops on a new drug dealer that moved in. And the neighborhood racked up something like 56 phone calls to the sheriff's office, and nothing ever really happened. Now, if you look carefully at that post right there, you can see that there's graffiti on it. So it isn't a perfect neighborhood. There are still many things happening in this community. And we were driving around 1 in the morning, well past midnight. So it's very late at night. Not too many people are out this late. It was a Friday night, so that's just kind of should give us a little bit more of an environment. But Pomona Park looked like a complete ghost town. And I have to admit, there have been great changes, possibly for the better, in Pomona Park since the last time we were here. So there's development and there's just a better environment. But Pomona Park is still not a place I would move to, since in the outskirts of the neighborhood, you still have homeless people in this vicinity. Keep in mind, too, that now there's more vacant real estate and there's properties that were damaged by the hurricane. So the homeless don't exactly have to end up in a homeless camp. There's a lot of vacant properties now, and this is where the homeless are now residing. So it's even harder than ever to track down the homeless now, because all they need is a bicycle and an abandoned house, and they can move right into a residential community. And when they call law enforcement to report it, law enforcement really doesn't care to do much about homeless people living in an abandoned property in a neighborhood that's out of sight, out of mind. In fact, you may remember when I made the videos regarding the new homeless laws in Florida that one of the kind of side effects of this law would be that homeless people would be forced into residential neighborhoods. And that's exactly what's happening in North Fort Myers. And with the reduction in population for the many reasons we have in Florida, we're now seeing that the homeless don't exactly have to be in a homeless camp. They can hide very well in abandoned, hurricane-destroyed homes in residential neighborhoods. And these are the types of places where these homeless people are never going to be extracted from unless a property owner comes along and tries to get the cops involved, which is very unlikely for abandoned properties. Now, this gas station here used to be the homeless headquarters. Anytime you pull up to this gas station many years ago, there may be 10 or 15 homeless people hanging out at this gas station. At this moment, there are 0. But keep in mind that law enforcement has been really difficult on the homeless and that these people are still in the community. A lot of them were in jail and locked up. They didn't kill anybody, so they're going to have to let them go eventually, which means that eventually the homeless people may be gone for a while from the presence of the streets. If you've wondered what's happened to all the droves of homeless people that used to live here, right? Because there's homeless people everywhere in North Fort Myers. Certainly they have to be somewhere. A lot of them are locked up. Some of them have outright disappeared. Unfortunately, a lot of them did die from overdoses during the opiate epidemic. Now that whole thing is starting to turn back around. It's not as bad as it used to be, but it's still considerable. Regardless, just because as a whole nationally it's going down, there are still a few places in Florida, particularly South Florida, where overdose deaths are still through the roof. Now, a lot of people switch from the F to the synthetic. So now with the synthetic being more common, you have less overdoses. But keep in mind, the synthetic has worse long-term mental health effects than the F. The F at least doesn't have those long-term mental health effects. So it's just a different sort of problem that isn't as trackable. And this is what's happening to a lot of the changes we're seeing in Florida. Sometimes things look really good on paper, but if you really understand what's happening in the background, the situation isn't as sweet as many people would believe. So now the next community we're going to roll through is called Suncoast Estates. Now this community used to be called the Scumcoast Estates. It is the largest single mobile home park in the United States. At least that's what some people accredit this neighborhood to be. The entrance of the neighborhood doesn't look bad. A few newer gas stations, some road repairs. It really doesn't look like a bad place. But if you've lived in Southwest Florida, you know all about the Scumcoast and the reputation it has. Now this area is known as a huge meth area, and you can tell because everybody has really large bright lights on everything. Now when the F was really at its peak some time ago, this is what you would have seen at this gas station. A little theatrical work on my part here, but this is what you would have seen at this gas station if you had came here maybe a year and a half ago. Now, you don't see as much of that. Now, word on the street is that everybody switched back to meth. Now, if you've traveled across America, you know that when you see really bright lit areas like this, it's usually an area that has a lot of meth users because they get paranoid and they really don't like to be out in the dark. They like to be in bright areas. So one just detail that you would know if you've traveled across America like I have is when you see an area where there's all these bright lights, it's usually because you have a huge meth problem. People that are paranoid, like here, there was a guy at this gas station. When I pulled up, he left. You're going to see another guy at the other gas station, and just as I pulled up, you're going to see that he leaves as well. So this is a huge meth area, and people here are just really paranoid. You can see that the lights are extraordinarily blinding, and this is just, again, something that is usually related to an area that has a lot of meth users. And even in the residential neighborhoods, you'll see many houses have just, it looks like an airport pulling in some of these residential streets back here. The lighting situation just has to do with the fact that there's so many people on meth. Now, this area got completely destroyed by Hurricane Ian, so there's an abundance of abandoned mobile homes. And these mobile homes are now where the homeless people are living. And this is called squatting. And if the homes are abandoned, they simply do not care. So we're going to go into Suncoast Estates now and drive around the residential neighborhoods, and you're going to see that there's just an abundance of really bright lights, people walking around with flashlights, people with lights everywhere. It's a real heavy meth using area, And this area here is really a bad neighborhood. Now, somebody recently wrote a story out of Fort Myers about lighting in this neighborhood, and I think they wrote a horrendous story. Now, they wrote a story about how people in this neighborhood want more lighting, and what meth head wouldn't, right? So there's a petition going around, and somebody actually wrote a news story about it. I think it's kind of an embarrassing story. You'll see, like, look at these mobile homes here. Who has that much lighting around their property? Look at the next mobile home. So what happens is that people are all methed out. They're up all night. You can see some of these houses just have like an incredible amount of lighting. And it's simply because the people are all methed out. They're up all night digging through trailers and making bicycles and doing stuff. It's just a trailer park. I mean, go figure. It's known as the Suncoast. So, and it's vast. It's massive. There wouldn't be enough time on today's video, but you can see here the tire tracks where people have been doing donuts on the road. And as we're driving through this neighborhood, you'll see a lot of people on bicycles with flashlights. And all this just indicates that this is a very high meth use area. And I think this story was kind of distasteful because it's a story about how the community is petitioning for lighting. Here's somebody walking around with a flashlight, right? Now, they have a blanket on them, right? So anybody walking around with a blanket is a homeless person. Most people don't do that. The only people who walk around with blankets are homeless people. So here's a homeless person walking around a residential neighborhood with a blanket. But on top of that, he's got a flashlight. Look at the lighting on all these mobile homes. So you start to get the idea that this area is really methed out. When you got people walking around with flashlights, everybody has lights everywhere. So these are like really paranoid people, aka meth users. Now, it's been about a year since I was last in this community, and I just drove around. And while driving around, I figured out where the new trap house was. So go figure. If me driving around one time for the first time in a year, I was instantly able to pick up on where the new trap spot is, you think law enforcement that has people living in this community doesn't know where the new trap spots are? Of course they know. But normally, why would a community have this much lighting? Or why would a community be so concerned with lighting, right? I mean, for one, the only thing open in this entire area is a gas station that's closed down, right? And then that corner store. There are no businesses. There's no restaurants. It's one giant trailer park. It's the giantest trailer park in America. There's nothing open here at night. One corner store is open late at night. So you're telling me that in this vastness of nothing but mobile homes, you have this many people vagrantly walking around with flashlights at night? It's pretty clear there's a problem here. And it's just, again, a lot of homeless people, a lot of junkies. But imagine this, this is a kind of rural mobile home area, kind of large lots, kind of almost semi-rural. And then you got all these people walking around with flashlights at night, homeless people wrapped in blankets with flashlights. Let's just give you an idea of the type of place that North Fort Myers is, particularly the Suncoast. You can also see there's garbage all over the road. So this is the type of neighborhood that's always had a bad reputation. Has it cleaned up? Possibly, a little bit better than before, sure. But the fact that here you are in a street that is residential at 1 in the morning, and just on this one particular street, we see several people with bicycles, headlights. What the crap is going on? And there is clearly trapping going on in this neighborhood. Still, all it took was one drive to the neighborhood, and I figured it out. But that's the reality of North Fort Myers. This area is still plagued with a lot of problems. And driving around in the back streets of residential areas, you find homeless people walking around at night. You think that doesn't lead to car break-ins? You think that doesn't lead to bicycles missing? You think that doesn't lead to house break-ins, home invasion, robberies? You think these people aren't possibly squatting abandoned properties in this neighborhood? Absolutely. Now, as we approach the next block here, you'll see the red dot right there. That's somebody on a bicycle with a flashlight. Now, they saw us pass by. They were just standing there with a bicycle. And as soon as we passed, they got spooked and then they ran off. So I tried to drive around the block to intercept them to see who it was, because I thought it was kind of weird that somebody would just be in front of a property with a bicycle at 1 in the morning. Obviously, they're behind the gate, so why would you just be randomly standing in front of this house? Right here on the right, you can see a bicycle on the ground as well. Now, in a neighborhood like this, you don't leave bicycles outside the fence, so the fact that the bicycle is outside the fence would indicate that somebody is on a bicycle and they walked into this property. So here's yet another person with a bicycle and a light. It could have been the person from before, but I think it's not, because if you look further ahead, I think there's another one. But go figure. I mean, here's a neighborhood where people have, look at the lights in front of this house right here on the right. Look at how many lights that house has. That is some serious light work, and there's cameras on top of it. But you can look at this, like the lights from the house are bigger than the lights from my car. You can see it overshadow my vehicle lights. So there's still a lot of crappery going on in North Fort Myers. And can you imagine living in this neighborhood? Bunch of homeless people on bicycles just ransacking your whole neighborhood the whole night. People have to have these giant lights and cameras to, I mean, it just indicates how bad things are here. So yeah, it might look like a quiet area, but should you really have on one street 3 or 4 homeless people ransacking your neighborhood at night? Probably not, to be exact. Alright everybody, so that is the reality of life in North Fort Myers in the year 2025. If you've ever wondered what's on the other side of that bridge, there's still a lot of homeless camps hidden in the woods. Now there's a lot of abandoned properties that are being squatted. There's no reason for there to be homeless people walking around a residential neighborhood at 1 in the morning. If you live in a residential area and you have homeless people ransacking your neighborhood all night, living in that place must be a complete crap hole. Imagine you're sleeping in your house and the entire night there's just homeless people ransacking the neighborhood, trying to get their hands on whatever they can overnight. This is the reality of North Fort Myers. At first glance, there's a lot of new developments and exciting new construction sites popping into the city. And to be fair, the face of North Fort Myers along the main streets has changed dramatically, but endemically, many of the problems, namely the people and their addictions that reside in North Fort Myers, are still here. And while a lot of the homeless people right now are hiding in the woods or hiding in abandoned properties or hiding in the Lee County Jail, eventually the problem is still there, persistent and endemic to the area. And North Fort Myers is still not the type of place I would want to live in, despite the apparent improvements at face value. North Fort Myers, underneath it all, still has a lot of problems. Until Lee County addresses the homeless and addiction problem that this community is facing, it will always continue to be a crap hole. You can knock down fields where the homeless camps are and put in new luxury apartments, but if people are not able to make enough money to live there, they're still going to be living in the woods behind those apartment complexes and not inside of them. The reality is that it seems like many of the changes that are happening in North Fort Myers are nothing more than superficial. It's like putting lipstick on a pig, a homeless pig. And maybe it's not even lipstick, maybe it's a meth pipe that's going near its mouth. But the problem is that endemically this area continues to have the same underlying problems, continuing to be a poor trailer park area, predominantly white. Now, over the last few years, the Hispanic community grew significantly here in North Fort Myers, but I think with recent changes, that's going to shrink again, and it's going to go back to being nothing but pure white trashery. And unfortunately for the decent New Yorkers and Cubans that live in Cape Coral, on their way back from their daily commutes in Naples or Fort Myers, they have to drive through this crap hole. But I'm sure they don't understand how bad things are in the back streets, in the mobile home parks. When you start to explore North Fort Myers today, you'll see that many of the things that are happening here are nothing more than superficial, because deep down, it continues to be the same old NOFO that it's always been. And if the Lee County Sheriff Office closed down one trap house, another one opens up across town, it seems like crime is just endemic to North Fort Myers. And no matter how good the intentions are of the community to conceal the reality of North Fort Myers, it's somewhat of an encumbrance to try to pass off North Fort Myers as a decent place. You know, as I drive back to the street again, I noticed that even on the electrical post, there's cameras. I don't know if you guys caught that, but there seems like there's cameras looking at you in every direction. The people that live in these communities are paranoid, even if they're not methed out, because the amount of crime that they have to deal with in their communities. Anything left outside here will certainly disappear. The good thing is it will always reappear in a nearby pawn shop. If you live in the NOFO or are familiar with this crap hole of an encroachment of a city, do you guys believe that the changes are significant or artificial? I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions.